Good evening, and a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Robin Celikates, and together with Rahel Jaeggi, I'm directing the Center for Social Critique, which organizes the annual Benjamin Lectures, and it's an immense pleasure to welcome all of you tonight. Truly wonderful to see such a large crowd again. Many of you have been here yesterday, some new faces as well for the second lecture of this year's series. We had a really great evening yesterday with an exciting and inspiring first lecture by Tommie Shelby, this year's Benjamin Chair, on the political ethics of the oppressed.
So yesterday evening, we have learned that the political ethics of the oppressed does not only concern itself with the classical philosophical questions, what is a just social order or what is a good life? Rather, in the anything but ideal situation of enduring injustice, the political ethics of the oppressed is an answer to the question what constitutes a morally responsible and dignified response from the oppressed to their ongoing oppression. In yesterday's Q&A, the first question was if such an ethics includes a justification for political violence. But throughout the lecture, Tommie Shelby made clear that his focus is not the confrontational logic of oppressed versus oppressor. His focus is, so to say, the internal perspective of the collective that has to fight oppression. The oppressed, as he defined them, are those who suffer the most in an unjust social order. Their solidarity is not rooted purely in overlapping interests, although political parties, social movements, and political alliances are of value in their own right, of course. The identity of the oppressed as a group is created by their shared subordinate condition. Tommie insisted that this shared situation creates a strong bond and results in a tradition of struggles which might even outlive oppression itself.
So from this vantage point, it's clearly the case that solidarity is at the center of the political ethics of the oppressed. On Tommie's understanding, solidarity requires mutual identification on the part of those who are members of such a group of the oppressed, a commitment to assist and protect those with whom one identifies, but also common values and goals, loyalty within the group, and last but not least, mutual trust. All of these are forged in struggle. Tonight, Tommie will turn to how these very challenging demands relate to the individual's aspiration to self-fulfillment, to self-realization, to leading a life in accordance with one's own intellectual and life goals, especially in the case of intellectuals, in fact, concerned with their intellectual integrity. I'm sure you're all eager to hear how Tommie addresses and maybe even resolves this challenge and the tensions that go hand in hand with that relation between intellectual activity and the requirements of solidarity. Now, please join me in welcoming back Tommie Shelby, and I wish us all a great evening.
Thank you so much for the introduction, for summarizing what I did yesterday, so it saved me a little bit of time. So I appreciate that very much. I'm, of course, enormously pleased to be here and very happy that you all are here to discuss with me these matters about the political ethics of the oppressed. So when Richard Wright published his memoir, Black Boy, in 1945, the title chosen by the publisher reflected the story of a young black boy growing up in the Jim Crow South. But Wright actually wanted to call the book American Hunger. That title, I think, really better captures the essence of the book. Wright describes not only his physical hunger, but also a deeper hunger, an intense intellectual curiosity and a desire to make sense of the world around him. This desire for a life of the mind raises, I think, important questions about the political ethics of the oppressed, that is, about the principles and values that should guide the oppressed as they confront enduring injustice. When a social group is persistently denied basic rights and respect, what place, if any, is there for members who seek knowledge or creative expression simply for its own sake? Is such a life an irresponsible retreat from the group's collective struggle for justice? Or is it consistent with the demands of solidarity? So in this lecture, what I want to do is explore some tensions between two weighty commitments. There's the commitment of solidarity, discussed last night, and then there's the pursuit of intellectual life, with its emphasis on independent thought and free expression. Now, this tension can, of course, arise for anyone, but my focus is going to be on its significance for oppressed groups, where I think the conflict is often particularly acute. Wright's life offers a compelling window into this tension. His childhood and family life, his conflicts with the Black community, and especially his uneasy relationship with the Communist Party, all these, I think, reflect the challenge of reconciling a life of the mind with political solidarity. Wright grew up poor in the Jim Crow South, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, and he came of age in deeply impoverished conditions. His father abandoned the family when Wright was quite young, and his mother had frequent bouts of serious illness, which made it nearly impossible for her to maintain steady employment. As a result, Wright's family suffered great housing insecurity and rarely had enough to eat. At times, his mother had to appeal to charitable institutions for aid. And for at least a brief period, Wright and his younger brother were forced to live in an orphanage in order to have their basic needs met. Though a gifted student, Wright was unable to regularly attend school because he often had to find paid work to support his brother and his ailing mother. And much of Black Boy chronicles this tragic aspect of Wright's youth, a time in his life that was as dark and lonely as death, he laments. Now, when thinking beyond his own pressing bodily needs to, say, the broader material needs of Black people, Wright naturally emphasized the need for political resistance. Changing the material conditions that circumscribe the lives of the Black poor is obviously imperative and urgent. However, Wright also thought it was critical for Black people to satisfy what I'm here going to call spiritual hunger, a craving for meaning and moral purpose. He sought to explain how a political ethics of the oppressed should respond to this specific kind of deprivation. And here I think Wright's own life is particularly instructive. He reports that as soon as he learned some basic math and gained literacy, a consuming curiosity grew in him. He became one of those annoyingly inquisitive children, constantly asking questions of adults about his social environment or about the prevailing norms. At age 12, his curiosity was dramatically fueled after he was first introduced to novels. As he says, I had tasted what to me was life, and I would have more of it, somehow, some way. His insatiable appetite for books would eventually extend beyond fiction to other subjects like sociology and psychology and even philosophy. He says, a vague hunger would come over me for books, books that opened up new avenues of feeling and seeing. This love of reading quickly expanded into a love of writing. As Wright says, wrestling with words gave me my moments of deepest meaning. Wright describes this devotion to reading, to writing, to learning as no mere diversion from the harsh realities of life, but rather, or not even something that's done for the occasional enjoyment. For him, it really was a way of life. The curiosity that drove Wright was not really for practical knowledge, right? He wasn't necessarily looking for the key to liberation or for some concrete strategies to fight injustice. It was really learning for its own sake, if you like, a kind of intellectual nourishment. His attitude toward life was one that, quote, made him love talk that sought answers to questions that could help nobody, and that could only keep alive in him that enthralling sense of wonder and awe in the face of the drama of human feeling, which is hidden behind the external drama of life. Now, not everyone develops a deep sense of curiosity or an abiding interest in ideas. That thirst for knowledge is perhaps even rarer among those who are oppressed. The truly disadvantaged are more likely to be preoccupied with daily survival. And there generally isn't much time or opportunity to take up intellectual pursuits. Moreover, many are actively discouraged from taking up pursuits, or perhaps they face formidable social barriers to doing so. But some among the oppressed do nonetheless acquire an abiding curiosity. And a few, like Wright, develop an ambition to pursue a life of the mind as their primary vocation. We become intellectuals. Now, within this category of intellectuals, I mean to include a range of types of people. Some people might be writers or scholars, some people might be journalists, they're going to be visual artists, performing artists, and others still. So as I reflect on the ethical lives of the oppressed, I'm led to ask a question that those from more privileged groups might not feel the need to ask. And that is it acceptable to take up purely intellectual pursuits as a way of life? Or to put it somewhat differently, does the political ethics of the oppressed permit such an orientation toward living? Now, within the African American political tradition, one generally finds only negative answers to this question. Given the imperative to improve the lives of the unjustly disadvantaged, intellectual work for its own sake strikes a lot of people as, at best, a sort of selfish indulgence, and at worst, a kind of callous disregard for the urgent needs of the oppressed. The priority for members of oppressed groups, some argue, should be political resistance. Insofar as intellectual pursuits are defensible, these must be in the service of a liberatory aim. Public protests, political education, exposing injustice, defending political ideals, and so on. Intellectual life for its own sake will be a legitimate practical aim only when just conditions have been secured. So in a phrase, intellectualism for its own sake only after the revolution. And we might call this the service conception of intellectual endeavors. And it's defended by the great Black radical thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois. In his 1926 essay, Criteria of Negro Art, Du Bois argued that Black artists have an indispensable role to play in creating a just world. They have a duty to use their art to advance the cause of justice and Black freedom. Apolitical intellectual and artistic activity, Du Bois insisted, is not really threatening to those in power. Just the opposite, in fact. The powerful welcome and solicit such pursuits and may even reward them, so long as this will prevent or lessen militant agitation for equality. We must, Du Bois maintained, avoid playing into the hands of our oppressors. And this would include resisting the temptations of money, of fame, public celebration that come at the cost of the group's advancement and sometimes our own self-respect. Not only are Black people not allowed the full intellectual and artistic freedom that others enjoy, they are largely limited to forms of inquiry and creative expression that don't challenge white dominance. So Du Bois reminds us that though the fight for equality has been long, it's been exhausting, and at times it's been deadly, but black people shouldn't channel their intellectual and artistic energy into work that white people will permit and admire. Now, Du Bois's strictures would appear to apply most strongly, and maybe even exclusively, to those with obvious intellectual gifts. The reason is that such talents could be used instead to advance the group's pressing justice claims. As Du Bois argued in his 1903 essay, The Talented Tenth, intellectually gifted black individuals should provide leadership for their people. Their talents should be devoted to solving what he called the Negro problem. Within the black political tradition, the main argument for this position centers on the commitment of solidarity. So as discussed in last night's lecture, the members of oppressed groups have strong reasons to commit to in-group solidarity. This solidarity serves as a collective self-defense against maltreatment, and it can be a vehicle for advancing the group's emancipatory cause. The effectiveness of this group unity is going to depend on members using whatever abilities, opportunities, and resources they possess to aid the group in its struggle for justice. So here, there has to be a broad division of labor within the group, with each playing the role they are best suited for, and each contributing where they are most needed. So, for example, we intellectuals often have privileges and resources, training, that could help us expose injustices, maybe diagnose their causes, and maybe discover solutions to the group's predicament. Now, I think it's important here to distinguish the advantages that some intellectuals have that other members of an oppressed group might also enjoy. So these others might lack intellectual interests or skills, but could have advantages such as class status or material resources, political influence, social capital, institutional position, so on. For example, there might be a duty for all the privileged members of the group to share their material resources with members of the group who are less fortunate. What is more, we should also note that not all intellectuals are privileged. Some are poor, some are imprisoned, or they might otherwise be deeply disadvantaged. So the question then is whether there are abilities and skills specific to intellectuals that we should be using for the good of our unjustly treated group. These would include things like critical and analytical thinking, maybe competence in research methods, advanced knowledge, the ability to write effectively, extraordinary creativity, and so on. Now, when speaking of the special role here for black intellectuals, the argument I'm considering and want to discuss does not imply that intellectuals have a greater responsibility to correct injustice than others do. No, everybody has a responsibility to contribute to correcting unjust social arrangements. Rather, by a special role, I mean a distinctive role. So when it comes to intellectuals, our distinctive role is in virtue of our intellectual skills, talents, and opportunities. And so we should carry the struggle forward largely, if you like, on the battlefield of ideas. You might think here of the would-be scholar activist or the public intellectual, for examples. So in view of this argument, someone like Richard Wright could be regarded as running afoul of the political ethics of the oppressed. He could be said to have misused or wasted talents that could have contributed to freeing or helping his people. So what might Wright say in his own defense? Now, there's much in the argument for the special role of black intellectuals that Wright might concede. Du Bois and Wright would agree, for example, that among the stigmas that denigrate black people is the stereotype that we are of low intelligence and incapable of true creative excellence. Racist ideology suggests that black people have limited cognitive ability, which makes us suited for only menial or subordinate roles in society. So when talented black people demonstrate their gifts through intellectual artistic pursuits, this arguably serves to refute a deeply insulting stereotype. Moreover, black youth sometimes accept these stereotypes about black ability and thus severely truncate their aspirations, adapting them to limited life goals. Black intellectuals and artists can counteract this tendency by setting an example of Black excellence in these domains. This kind of example can inspire youth, can boost their self-confidence, it can provide concrete models that they might emulate. This salutary effect would be realized even if such intellectual pursuits are not undertaken for this purpose. So an intellectual or artist who pursues a life of the mind or creative expression for its own sake, provided of course they do so well, nevertheless contributes to defying the racial order. The work of the mind is a form of rebellion. It's a revolt against accepting their low place in the status hierarchy. A life focused on ideas, then, can itself be a kind of resistance, despite this not being the person's conscious aim or motivation. Du Bois and Wright would also agree, I think, that the pursuit of knowledge can help one better understand one's social conditions. One is less unfree, though perhaps more discontent, when one has a clear grasp of the nature of one's subordination. Think here, if you like, of taking the red pill in the movie The Matrix. The liberated mind here, right, is half the battle. And as the Black radical feminist Bell Hooks suggests, this kind of knowledge can be healing for the oppressed, perhaps even leading to a kind of political awakening in them. Such learning could also lead to solutions to the group's problems, or at least to ways of reducing its suffering. Again, this needn't be the explicit or conscious aim of the inquiry. Practical solutions to existing problems sometimes arise when you're thinking about something else, matter totally unrelated. Though satisfying their own curiosity might be their motivation, the intellectual can sometimes hit upon ideas that have practical relevance. Oppressed groups should therefore encourage deep learning and critical thinking among their members, because this increases their chances of finding paths to liberation. Now, there is, I believe, tremendous truth in these responses to Du Bois's concerns. Yet I guess I fear that they concede too much to the service conception of intellectual life. They imply or presuppose that a life of the mind is justified only if it contributes, at least indirectly or in the long run, to the group's struggle for justice and liberation. So I'd like to offer a different, maybe somewhat less defensive response to Du Bois. My claim is simply this: the oppressed are not only entitled to basic freedoms, but their attempts to exercise these freedoms, even in the face of systemic injustice, is compatible with their solidaristic obligations. So the freedoms I have in mind here include more than political liberties, right? The right to vote, the right to protest, speak truth to power, so on. These are clearly vital tools in the pursuit of justice. But the members of oppressed groups are entitled, I think, to something more, and that is the freedom to seek meaning. That is, they are, or should be, free to shape their lives in accordance with a worthwhile ideal of life. I think to deny this would be to suggest that the oppressed must wait for justice until they can truly live. Some, of course, will naturally find such meaning in fighting injustice, and I in no way mean to disparage political activity as a way of life. It can be an admirable, even honorable way to live a life. But not all will find this way of life fulfilling or attractive, nor should all be expected to. The issue, as I see it, is about the freedom to take up life pursuits that are both worthwhile and intrinsically satisfying, even if these pursuits have no real potential to change society for the better. Resistance and survival aren't the only imperatives for oppressed people. So here we might, following Wright, speak of the pursuit of meaning as a freedom the oppressed are not obliged to abandon or delay until justice is realized. Now, I don't think meaning is purely subjective. Truly meaningful lives are good lives, well-lived lives. Some lives though favored by those who live them, are frankly pathetic or contemptible. So consider a life spent amassing a fortune for no better purpose than surpassing others' wealth. There are also lives that sharply conflict with our moral duties to others. Living as a gangster so one can experience power over others, I think, reveals a distorted sense of what makes a life worthwhile. I am, however, a pluralist about meaning. There are many ways to live a meaningful life. One such way is a life devoted to satisfying one's intellectual curiosity or creating things of beauty. Again, my contention is that pursuits of this kind, when taken up as a way of life, are consistent with the political ethics of the oppressed. I don't believe that other oppressed people, even other black people with whom one might have solidarity, have grounds to object to the exercise of this freedom. I can't see the case for thinking that an apolitical life of the mind comes at the expense of other black people, say. Black people don't have a valid grievance, I think, against black intellectuals who choose to contribute to the collective struggle in some other way. I do believe that solidarity can and usually does require personal sacrifice. But I think the traditional Du Boisian division of labor premise, that each must play the role they are best suited to perform and where they are most needed, is too demanding and overly prescriptive. We don't have a responsibility rooted in our commitment to solidarity to use our talents in a maximally efficient way to advance the group's emancipatory cause. To think otherwise is to view our individual lives as mere instruments for the efficient production of justice. The oppressed are not obliged to see their lives as no more than heroic scenes in a grand story in which their oppressors are ultimately defeated. Now, Du Bois did see his life this way. In his 1940 memoir, Dusk of Dawn, an autobiography of a race concept, he says this in the opening apology. My life had its significance, and its only deep significance because it was part of a problem. But that problem was, as I continue to think, the central problem of the greatest of the world's democracies, and so the problem of the future world. Now, that life, despite its conceit, was no doubt appropriate for Du Bois. And I'm glad he chose it, right? And I greatly admire him for doing so. But that life is not one that's fitting for us all. Not even, I think, for all of us who lay claim to the label intellectual. Though I find the argument from solidarity tempting, and maybe sometimes I've assumed it myself in my own work, the legitimacy of the individual pursuit of meaning, even under conditions of oppression, leads me to conclude that there must be some personal discretion over how they will contribute to the collective struggle. And this discretion includes not putting one's unique assets at the disposal of the group if this would threaten finding meaning in one's own life. The exercise of this discretion would be a breach of group solidarity only if it wrongs other members of the group or would involve a break with the group's basic values and goals. There is, however, I think, a deeper tension between the demands of solidarity and the pursuit of meaning through intellectual life. And this is because the commitment to the life of the mind makes its own demands. And these demands can pull against the requirements of solidarity. Intellectualism as a vocation comes with its own distinctive dispositions and prerogatives. Intellectuals, properly so called, strive to cultivate and maintain an independent critical mind. We think for ourselves, often challenging received wisdom and probing the assumptions others take for granted. We're willing to entertain strange and sometimes unpopular ideas, and at times embrace positions that others might find perplexing or even unsettling. We question the legitimacy of inherited traditions and established authorities, including those we perhaps once revered. Intellectuals are marked by a disposition, sometimes even a compulsion, to reconsider our own beliefs. For us, dogmatism is intolerable. Ignorance, a condition to be resisted. When we speak or write publicly, we aim to say only what we sincerely believe. It's no surprise, then, that intellectuals seek environments where open expression is not only permitted, but protected. Spaces where we can think aloud without fear of censorship or reprisal. Now, many in what we might call the professions of the mind, scholars, scientists, writers, artists, and so on, are not intellectuals in the sense I mean, because they don't see their work as a vocation or a kind of ethical calling. Moreover, in describing the demands of intellectual life, I don't mean to suggest that all who answer the call fully live up to these demands. And here, of course, I don't exempt myself. So what I want to do in the remainder of this lecture is explore a tension between this commitment to the life of the mind and the commitment to solidarity. And again, I think Richard Wright's life and writings are instructive. I think he can help us better understand the depth of this conflict and maybe, just maybe, a possible resolution to it. So recall that solidarity entails a joint and reciprocal commitment to mutual identification, special concern for group members, loyalty, mutual trust, shared values or goals. The values and goals in question need not be political in nature, and so solidarity can exist in groups such as families or religious communities, ethnic groups, and other social groups that may not share a political cause. So I'm going to start by highlighting the conflict that can exist between the life of the mind and solidarity within groups of this sort. When Wright was in 8th grade and living in Jackson, Mississippi with extended family, he wrote and published his first short story in the local newspaper, the Southern Register. He called the story "The Voodoo of Hell's Half Acre." Unfortunately, that piece is lost to history. But Wright said the plot was about a villain who sought a widow's house. And he described the story as, quote, crudely atmospheric, emotional, intuitively psychological, and stemming from pure feeling. Wright was proud of the story, yet friends and family reacted negatively to it. His intellectual and artistic interests alienated his friends. They couldn't understand why a black kid would write a story just so other people could read and perhaps be amused by it. His zealously religious grandmother objected that the story wasn't true, and so condemned it as the devil's work. His Uncle Tom expressed contempt for the story, dismissing it as having no point. His Aunt Addie was appalled at the use of the word hell in the title, and thought it suggested that Wright needed an adult to guide him toward better ends. Even Wright's mother, usually supportive, chastised him for being weak-minded and hurting his chances to find local employment. When Wright was in 9th grade, his last year of formal education, as it turns out, he was selected valedictorian of his class and tasked with delivering a public speech on graduation night. He dutifully wrote the speech, and again, he was proud of it. However, the principal of the school demanded that Wright deliver a speech that the principal had written for him, telling Wright, "You can't afford to just say anything before these white people that night." Yet, Wright declined, offering the reason that he didn't want to give a speech someone else had written. In an angry response, the principal threatened Wright with not graduating and with being blacklisted for teaching jobs in the community. Wright still refused to submit. He mused, "The principal's speech was simpler and clearer than mine, but it didn't say anything. Mine was cloudy, but it said what I wanted to say." After news spread about his conflict with the principal, Wright was pressured by classmates and family members to reconsider. He did not. And on graduation night, he delivered his own speech and received only faint applause. He says he didn't care. During the Jim Crow era of the American South, churches functioned as more than places of worship and religious ritual. For Black people, they were sites of communal solidarity and sometimes political organization. In Black Boy, Wright tells the story of his baptism. He was urged by friends to attend a church revival, despite his open lack of interest in religion. He reluctantly agreed. On the night of the revival, a small group of Black boys, including Wright, were singled out as belonging to no church and professing no religion, and pressured to make a public confession of faith and join the church. Now, Wright interpreted this action as a communal demand that he make a public vow to join the community in solidarity. He says, "We young men had been trapped by the community, the tribe in which we lived and of which we were a part. The tribe, for its own safety, was asking us to be at one with it. Our mothers were kneeling in public and praying for us to give the sign of allegiance." This demand, Wright tells us, was not about belief in God, it's not about eternal salvation. This tight little Black community, as he called it, needed to know whether Wright and the other boys were committed to being trustworthy members of the group. This demand for conformity to in-group expectation was a test of loyalty. Wright ultimately submitted, and he allowed himself to be baptized. Though he felt anger and shame for going through with it, he expresses relief to have had this barrier between him and the community removed. It's nevertheless clear that Wright didn't think he should have to confess a faith he didn't share, to publicly express a belief he did not accept. Now, these three examples, Wright's first short story, his valedictorian speech, and his reluctant baptism, illustrate how the norms of solidarity can conflict with the commitments of intellectual life. Yet the tension between solidarity and intellectualism is, I think, even more profound when the solidarity is rooted in political values and objectives. We can see this by considering Wright's rocky affiliation with the Communist Party. So Wright left the American South as a young man searching for greater personal freedom and in pursuit of a writing career. At the age of 19, he moved to Chicago, where he lived for 10 years. There he worked long hours as a postal clerk and an insurance salesman. But he read voraciously and wrote poetry and short stories in his limited spare time. In 1933, he joined the local John Reed Club. Founded in 1929, John Reed clubs were organizations for left-wing writers and artists. The clubs were affiliated with the Communist Party and were used by the party to gain influence among radical intellectuals. Rejecting the idea of art for its own sake, the club's slogan was, "Art is a weapon in the class struggle." And soon after joining the Chicago branch of the club and becoming its executive secretary, Wright joined the Communist Party itself. During his years in Chicago, Wright came to know several communists, some of them white, some of them Black. He embraced many communist ideas, particularly the opposition to capitalism, to imperialism, and fascism. However, he came to worry about the influence of communist political practices among Black people. He says, "Black communist emotional certainty seemed buttressed by access to a fund of knowledge denied ordinary men. But a day's observation of their activities was sufficient to reveal all their thought processes. An hour's listening disclosed the fanatical intolerance of minds sealed against new ideas, new facts, new feelings, new attitudes, new hints at ways to live. They denounced books they had never read, people they had never known, ideas they could never understand, and doctrines whose names they could not pronounce." So the ideological certainty and militant ignorance that Wright is identifying here, I think, is not peculiar to communist forms of political engagement. Many social movements, political organizations, I think, exhibit or encourage similar tendencies, which I think are antithetical to the life of the mind. Solidarity, when organized around a political cause and its ideology, is also threatened by the dispositions of intellectuals. I think it's not really difficult to understand the danger here. Solidarity is built on a commitment to specific values or objectives. These are generally treated as settled convictions, not subject to reconsideration or revision. An unwavering embrace of these values and ends is treated as a test of loyalty and trustworthiness among those committed to the cause. But the intrinsic curiosity and incessant critical questioning of intellectuals have no bounds. No idea is really off limits, not even the values and ends that constitute their own group's solidarity. This kind of engagement with ideas can cause great anxiety within the social group or political organization or social movement. I think the basic dynamic can be illustrated through Wright's experience with the Communist Party. After Wright's first communist unit meeting, which was composed of only black members, comrades derisively and condescendingly referred to Wright as an intellectual, largely because of his manner of speech, saying, "He talks like a book." He was later chastised for reading books not endorsed by the party. He was told, quote, "Reading bourgeois books can only confuse you, comrade." The communists he knew lacked curiosity and seemed content to be exposed only to ideas the Communist Party approved. He was warned more than once that intellectuals, quote, "don't fit well into the party," that some have been expelled for a lack of revolutionary loyalty, and that a few have even been shot. Wright's interest in reading broadly, writing craft, and abstract ideas made his comrades uneasy and a bit suspicious. And the more he tried to make himself understood, the deeper the distrust he faced. Nevertheless, Wright fought hard to make space for artistic freedom within the party, but his proposals were repeatedly voted down. Party leaders at one point demanded that writers abandon their intellectual and creative projects and instead produce pamphlets for trade unions. So in this case, the John Reed clubs faced a crisis. In 1935, through an abrupt Communist Party decision, the clubs were disbanded. Now, Wright openly dissented from the party's decision and found that he could not adapt to the new policy. As he says, "My writing was my way of seeing, my way of living, my way of feeling. And who could change his sight, his notion of direction, his senses?" Consequently, Wright's relationship with the party grew worse. Accusations against him proliferated. Smuggler of reaction, bastard intellectual, an incipient Trotskyite. And soon, formal charges of disloyalty would be made against Wright, and he would make a public break with the party despite, he says, having little disagreement with the communist cause or its vision. Now, one might think that the problem here lies simply with the well-known excesses of the Communist Party and not with any deep tension between political solidarity and intellectual life as such. And certainly the problem was particularly acute and perhaps extreme in this case. Wouldn't deny that. But I think the lesson here has a wider application, as I hope you will agree. Indeed, the basic tension can arise in political organizations and movements that pride themselves on being non-hierarchical for reasons that I'll explain. Now, Wright thought it was irrational for political organizations and social movements to be hostile to intellectuals. Now, I wouldn't say it's strictly irrational. I do, however, agree that it's misguided, and I agree it's unethical. Some are wary of intellectuals because they often challenge the beliefs and values that anchor people's social identities. When a political cause becomes central to one's sense of self, when it provides deep meaning and moral purpose, it's natural to resist sharp criticism of that cause. Many would prefer to engage only with ideas that reinforce their convictions. The critical probing of intellectuals, however, can introduce doubt. posing an existential threat to those whose identities are really tightly bound up with the cause. The danger here is real, and I think shouldn't be dismissed. And that's why I say the hostility toward intellectuals is not entirely irrational. Yet I think it would be better to live with this risk than to exclude, silence, or marginalize intellectuals and social movements. Any legitimate political ethics must be rooted in sound values and goals. After all, not all social movements are good. Consider fascist or racist movements. Some might be earnestly but naively participating in a rotten movement. So I think it's imperative to remain self-critical and open to listening to objections from honest and sincere critics. It's essential to avoid the ideological dogmatism and self-satisfied ignorance the right warned us about. And I think intellectuals can provide some protection from these pitfalls. There's also a lesson here about the commitment of solidarity and its role in politics. There's nothing wrong with finding meaning in a political cause. We should nevertheless be careful not to model political solidarity on religious faith, at least not when such faith is zealous and unshakable. Sometimes it's right and wise to abandon or even to oppose a cause one was previously committed to. Though this certainly shouldn't be done lightly, it would be a mistake to construe this change of mind as effectively apostasy, a defection worthy of the equivalent of divine retribution. The idea of apostasy is governed by what we might call a sort of ethics of conversion, where abandoning the cause is treated as an unforgivable offense, possibly subject to punishment. Joining a group in political solidarity is not the same as joining a sacred community of the faithful, and the political ethics of the oppressed must avoid confusing the two. There's a different kind of anxiety that intellectuals create in political movements. Political leaders sometimes fear that the masses might be led away from a profound truth, a truth whose embrace is necessary for their liberation. They worry that intellectuals will produce needless doubt in those who lack the sophistication, say, to evaluate complex evidence and arguments. After all, the truth isn't always immediately transparent or easily understood. So persuasive thinkers can be, if only inadvertently, reactionary within a movement, or even counterinsurgent forces, leading people away from vital causes or perhaps fostering factionalism in a movement. Again, I want to say that this danger is real. It's not an irrational fear, but an ethical response to this genuine risk can't be to root out and purge intellectuals in the movement. Better, I think, to rely on political education and constructive debate and trust that the better argument will ultimately win out. That said, the burden cannot rest solely on movements to accommodate the idiosyncrasies of intellectuals. We as intellectuals must also prove ourselves to be trustworthy allies, committed not only to critical thought, but to the practical demands of solidarity. We must earn the trust of our comrades without compromising our devotion to the life of the mind. This means resisting the temptation to become so absorbed in abstract theorizing that we lose sight of the practical exigencies of collective struggle, especially the need, at times, to act amid deep uncertainty without the benefit of a fully developed analysis or blueprint. It also means accepting the outcomes of democratic decision-making within movements, even when we harbor reservations about those decisions. The positions we defend must be guided not by a hunger for things like prestige or money or fame, but by genuine commitment to truth and justice. We must remain in honest dialogue with the broader political community. We have to be open to its critique of our ideas and willing to share our work beyond elite platforms. And our political courage must extend beyond a mere embrace of provocative or unconventional views. It must also include a readiness to make some concrete sacrifices for the benefit of the cause. Of course, There are going to be some political leaders who fear intellectuals because these leaders don't want to lose their power to direct the political choices of those who follow them. They therefore engage in what might be called a kind of political paternalism, shielding ordinary people from what are regarded as dangerous or maybe even heretical ideas. Now, whether they do so for benevolent reasons or a lust for power, I believe, and hope you will agree, they act unethically. And here I follow Martin Luther King Jr. in thinking that our political means must be as morally defensible as our fundamental political aims. Evil means are not, of course, redeemed by the desirable outcomes they might produce. Indeed, where possible, I think our means should prefigure our ends and thereby be a model for the kind of social relations that we hope to create. The political ethics of the oppressed should therefore be rooted in a democratic ethos. We should approach our fellows in solidarity on a plane of equality, trust, and mutual respect. This is even of greater consequence, I think, with solidarity among the oppressed. Oppressed groups are generally treated as subordinates and as unworthy of equal regard. For their political leaders to treat them as anything less than equals is, I think, a grave insult to them, an assault on their self-respect. Now, in the end, I suspect that there is more space for intellectuals to be committed to a political movement or to a cause than there is for them to be committed to a particular political organization. Political movements are always somewhat amorphous and open-ended. Different organizations, each with their own specific platform and institutional structure, can participate in the same political movement. The ideals of a political movement are subject to a range of interpretations by those who participate in it. So there's a sense in which the ideals of the movement are ever evolving, right? They're open to refinement through debate and public discussion. So in this case, Wright, as a committed intellectual, he could be a communist, but he couldn't be a member of the Communist Party. This same problem plagued another intellectual in the Black radical tradition, W.E.B. Du Bois. But Du Bois was the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He twice had a fierce and bitter feud with the organization's leadership, prompting him to leave the organization, or perhaps to be pushed out. Both departures from the NAACP were the result of Du Bois's evolving thinking on racial oppression and economic injustice, and how his change of views conflicted with the official position of the organization. The first departure was because Du Bois came to advocate a sort of pragmatic Black self-segregation and economic cooperation, and this was in opposition to the NAACP's uncompromising stance against all forms of racial separatism. The second departure was because Du Bois became increasingly radical in his political outlook and openly defended the Soviet Union during the Red Scare, despite the NAACP's staunch anti-communist position. Although Du Bois's commitment to Black solidarity and to the cause of Black freedom is really never wavered in his long life. As an intellectual, he was constantly rethinking his political philosophy and the concrete measures needed to realize it. In reflecting on the life and thought of Richard Wright and W.B. Du Bois, I think we can see the challenging, sometimes painful, tension between intellectual life and political solidarity. For those committed to both the pursuit of truth and the fight for justice, the path can sometimes be fraught. The intellectual's natural inclination to question, to revise, to dissent can put us at odds with the norms of loyalty and trust that solidarity demands. Yet it would be a grave mistake for political movements, particularly those rooted in the active resistance of the oppressed, to view this tension as a threat to be extinguished. It's better, I think, seen as a necessary and even productive friction, one that keeps our ideals honest, our commitments reflective, and our movements open to growth. Wright's own break with the Communist Party, like Du Bois's repeated departures from the NAACP, should not be seen as sort of acts of betrayal or apostasy, but rather as principled refusals to subordinate intellectual integrity to institutional conformity. Their examples remind us that fidelity to a cause does not always mean fidelity to an organization it claims to represent it. Political solidarity must leave space for intellectual independence, just as the life of the mind must remain attentive to the practical realities of collective struggles for freedom. So I think, held in balance, these commitments can sort of sharpen one another, fostering clear and careful thought and grounded practical wisdom. If a political ethics of the oppressed is to be defensible, I think it must resist not only the overt forces of domination, but also the sometimes more subtle temptations to dogma, to zealotry, and authoritarianism from within. It must be open to questioning and open to internal debate. And it must recognize the crucial role the intellectuals can play, despite their critical, not, I should say, despite their critical disposition, but rather because of it. Thank you so much.